and it was down in the valley. I remember I went to school here at the University of Toronto, and I showed up in the valley, and it was my first time there. It was my first experience in the US, in the tech scene. I walk into Google campus. At that time, Brain was about 40 people, and the first thing I hear as I'm passing by a kitchen is Quebecois French.
Right.
And so I hear Sammy Bengio, Joshua's brother, talking to another Quebecois French person down there. And that was the first hit of, you know, how Canadian AI is and how it had permeated even like the, you know, the most prestigious labs in Silicon Valley.
And, you know, what was the experience like? Like, how old were you?
I know that I couldn't drink down there, so I was like 19 or 20.
You were like 19 or 20. And you know, tell me about the process of writing it, like, of
Lukáš Kaiser, which is one of the other authors on the Transformer paper. And I actually didn't join to work on the Transformer. I joined to work on this much different project, which was to create one model to learn to do everything. Lukáš's idea was that we're going to create a massive model that can consume any data set humanity has produced. And so that's multimodal. It needs to be able to consume images, consume text, produce text, and everything in between, right? Audio included. I like to say that Lukáš operates, you know, half a decade ahead of his time. So while I was doing that, it was like a 12-week internship, I happened to be sat next to Noam Shazir. And Noam had been working on large language models forever. It's just that back then there was no transformer to scale them. And so he was working on RNNs, and what he wanted to do was he wanted to create a new architecture that was simpler, more refined, more scalable. And we found out that someone in the Translate group, which is a different part, we were in Brain, and there's another group in Translate, had the same idea. And that was Yaakov and Ashish and Nikki. And so all of us, we came together and we collaborated on building what's now the Transformer. Back then it was just, you know, an autoregressive model that happened to do really well at, you know, English and German translation.
And when you hit send on that paper, it was for the NeurIPS conference, right? Like, what was did you know what you were doing? Did you know this was going to be as big as it was?
No, I don't think, you know, one person had an idea. I remember we submitted the paper, it was like 2 a.m. or something. That was the conference deadline. And so we were still in the office. The only two people left were Ashish and me. I was laying on the couch and looking up at him. And he was like, Aidan, this is gonna be a big deal. And I was like, why? Isn't all research like this? This was the first time I was doing it.
Right, you're 20, you think this is what research is like.
This is just what research is. And so he saw it. I think if you ask him today, what he meant by that was, we're gonna get a lot of citations, this is a good academic contribution. I don't think anyone saw what it would be, what it would become.
Right, I mean, I think one of the fascinating things about Transformer-based AI is that it creates this shock in people, right? Like, it certainly did for me. Like, I remember for me it was using some GPT-3 where I asked it to finish Coleridge's poem, Kubla Khan, and it did it in this incredibly effective way, and I was just like, what is going on? Did you have a moment like that, like a moment of shock, where you're like, wow, this is something that I didn't expect?
Yeah, the first big shock came actually after my internship. I returned back here to Toronto. I was at U of T, I was doing research over the summer with the lab here, and I got an email from Lukáš, and the subject line was something like, look at this. And then in the body, it said, the Transformer. And then beneath it, I kept reading, and it was this story about a Japanese punk rock band that had gotten together, broken up, you know, put out these albums. And I got to the end of this article, and then Lukáš wrote, the only words I wrote were the Transformer. And so that was the first time I was sat in front of machine-generated text. Now that's like quaint, right? Like now everyone's so used to it, but back then it was like, computers just acquired the ability to use language. I thought everything was gonna change. I thought there was gonna be a product revolution. Like we just, for the first time, a non-human system was wielding language in a way as compelling as us. And so I thought everything was gonna change.
Can I just ask you, like, was your first reaction like joy? And then when did sort of fear kick in? Like when, because I sort of have this reaction too when I use it. Like the first reaction is like, oh my God, how incredibly wonderful is this? And then the sort of deeper questions sort of like slowly set in. Like, I guess you were only 20, so like, what was your? I mean, just tell me about the emotional reaction to it.
I'm very happy and optimistic that maybe in a quarter century, maybe in 25 years, if we do everything right as a field, we might have machines that can talk to us.
Right.
And then obviously I woke up the next morning and it was at our feet. And so it was a shock, but it was just so exciting to see progress, to see us pushing forward. For me, there wasn't a lot of fear in that moment.
So, obviously that was 2017. So in this field, that's like prehistory. That's like agricultural revolution time. What has, over the past 6 years, like what has surprised you most? Like what did you, like you had that moment, obviously it's elation, it's surprise, but what did you not see coming that came out of that?
It's been surprise after surprise. I think first I was surprised with the fact that we got there so soon, the fact that we got to computers that could speak to us so soon. Then I was surprised that the world took notice, that people latched onto the transformer, that it was adopted by the community and it became ostensibly the default. And then I was surprised that people, what really latched them on, what really brought them into seeing how powerful this technology was, it was dialogue, it was having a conversation with the model. In retrospect, that's obvious, right? Like it's what you and I are doing right now. It's the way that we all share our information and intellectual thoughts and ideas, and it's the way that we reason. And so it makes a lot of sense that conversation would be it, but it took me by surprise. And pleasant surprise. Like, I think at Cohere, we've been working on this for 3.5 years, nearly 4 now. And finally, it feels like people have woken up. They see it, and they're getting to use it for, the first time one-on-one. Because I think this technology has been in research labs and, kind of a niche knowledge that exists. And for the first time, everyone and their mom, their sister, their brother, they can actually interact with it themselves. And they're loving it. Like the passion that we're seeing in the field is just so rewarding. So I think that was the risk from social media. We didn't feel it immediately. There was no big bang, there was no flash, there was no extinction event, right? Like, it was just a subtle shifting in our behavior and our psychology that hurt us, and it amplified some of the worst patterns in human psychology, right? It really stoked addiction, things were optimized for extremes, things that elicited emotional reactions from people. And so my fear is that AI contributes to that same sort of subtle amplification of some of the most harmful parts of humanity. On the optimism side, and just to be clear, I'm way more optimistic than I am pessimistic about this technology. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if it was any other way. The opportunity to do good in healthcare, to transform the patient experience, to improve outcomes, the opportunity to transform GDPs. I think this technology, especially in a world where we're seeing inflation start to go up, it's a deflationary technology that's going to let humanity level up. Like the same thing that the steam engine did for mechanical labor, that took the loads off of humans' backs. Like, this is going to do that same thing for intellectual labor. So you're not going to be writing the same templated email 30 times a day. You're not going to be boring slowly, scrolling through stuff. You can automate so much of the worst part of your job and step up to someone that uses these tools and makes them much more efficient. So I think both the opportunity to improve human welfare in medicine as well as economically in GDP is just, it's massive.
I mean, but what would you say to people who think this is just going to replace, essentially white-collar jobs, like of all kinds of intellectual labor, and obviously into a system that, as you say, is already quite constricted, right?
Yeah, so I think for writers, there's like a whole set of activities, and in particular, the creative side, right? Where it's the humanity in your output that's valuable. I read a writer's piece of work for the writer, for their story, for their human experience, for their insight. I do it to resonate with them. I do it to empathize with them. And so I don't think that goes away because there are market forces which insist upon a human on the other side. What will happen, I think is already happening, is what you just described, augmentation. It's a tool for you, right? You write better stories because you're able to ideate much faster, explore a much wider breadth of possible paths the story can take. And so it becomes a tool for you, and our art gets better. It becomes a utility that sits next to you and amplifies you. And so that's kind of what I see. Similarly, like we've had massage chairs for a while. Masseuses are fun. You know, you're there for the human touch and like that experience. Same thing with therapists, right? You're there for the person who empathizes with you. Taking the person out of it, the market doesn't want that, and so that's not going to happen.